You know, you hear that phrase all the time now, I am a woman trapped in a man's body. And you just pause and think, how did we actually get here?
Right. How did that become not just understandable, but for many, like a fundamental statement of identity?
It's a huge declaration, shapes laws, lives, everything. But yeah, the how, that's the deep question.
It really is. It's like we're all swimming in this cultural water, and we often don't even notice the currents pushing us around, shaping how we think about ourselves.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are definitely plunging in. We're looking at the work of Dr. Carl Trueman, specifically his big book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
Subtitle, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. Quite a mouthful.
It is. But our mission today is to unpack that centuries-long journey he traces, the one that's shaped your idea of self, identity, and, yeah, especially the huge cultural shifts around sexuality.
Think of it as trying to see that cultural water you're swimming in. And for this, we've got a lot to draw on. A long conversation with Dr. Trueman himself. Plus, reviews, analyses of the book.
Yeah, a real stack of material. So it should give you a pretty full picture of his arguments and how others are engaging with them.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's start with Trueman. He's mainly known as a church historian, right? Like 16th, 17th century Puritans, John Owen, people like that.
Exactly. Deep Reformation, post-Reformation stuff. So writing this book was quite a departure for him.
So what made him do it? Why tackle something so well now?
It seems it was a real sense of urgency. He felt he needed to explain the whole sexual revolution thing, not just as something that popped up recently, but as like the result of this long story in the West.
Connecting the dots backwards.
Yeah. And especially with things like gay marriage, Obergefell v. Hodges, transgender issues becoming so prominent, he wanted to make sense of it. For Christians, sure, but also for a wider audience, to show everyone those currents we mentioned.
Okay, so if that's the why, what's the what? What is this modern self at the core of his argument?
Right, the main concept. For Trueman, it's about how we understand who we are and, crucially, where we find fulfillment. It's a massive shift from, say, looking outwards.
Outwards to what? Like God or community?
Exactly. External realities, transcendent truths, tradition, family roles. Whatever it was. Today, he argues, the self is defined much more by what's inside. Psychological forces, feelings.
Okay. And he breaks this down, gives it some characteristics, 6 of them, I think.
Yeah, 6 key traits. The first is that it's internal. You look inward to find your true self, deepest feelings, intuitions, that whole finding yourself journey.
Makes sense. Number 2.
It's expressive. It's not enough to just find that inner self. Authentic life means you have to express it outwardly. Show the world who you really are inside.
Be true to yourself means showing it.
Precisely. Third, it's seen as malleable and individual determined. Your identity isn't fixed by birth or station. You shape it through choices.
Like where you live, job, friends, beliefs.
All of it. It's your personal construction project.
Which leads to number 4. It's often opposed to social expectations.
Right. Because if your true self is internal and unique, then external pressures, tradition, institutions, expectations, they could feel like constraints. Like barriers to authenticity.
So rebellion can almost seem necessary.
For authenticity's sake, yeah. Regardless of, the actual moral content of that rebellion.
Okay, now the 5th one feels like a really big claim Trueman makes. This modern self is fundamentally sexual. What does that mean? Why is sexuality so central here?
This is absolutely pivotal to his argument. It's not just about sexual behavior. It's that our sexual desires, preferences, orientations, these are seen as being at the very core of who we are.
So not just something you do, but part of your fundamental identity.
Exactly. An authentic life, in this view, involves sexual fulfillment, expressing that core sexual self. And Trueman argues this is just completely new, historically unprecedented to put sexuality there right at the heart of personhood.
Wow, okay. And the last one, number 6.
It demands recognition. It's not enough for you to know and express your identity. You feel you have the right to demand that others recognize it, affirm it, validate it, especially when it comes to sexual and gender identity.
That's the whole package then. Internal, expressive, malleable, antisocial norms, sexualized, and demanding recognition.
That's the modern self, according to Trueman, and he calls the shift away from externally defined selfhood, well, seismic. Especially placing sexuality at the absolute center.
So his book tries to explain how this seismic shift happened. He breaks it into phases, right?
Yeah, 3 broad historical phases that built on each other.
Let's walk through them. Phase 1.
Phase 1 is what he calls the psychologization of the self. Think 18th, early 19th century. And the key figure here is Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Rousseau. Okay, what was his big contribution?
He basically flipped the script on human nature and society. Traditional views, often Christian, saw people as, flawed, maybe sinful, needing virtue taught or imposed by society or religion.
Right, born needing guidance.
Rousseau argued the opposite. He said our natural inner intuitions, our feelings, they are inherently good. It's society, civilization that corrupts us.
So trust your feelings, distrust society.
In a nutshell, yeah. The inner self gets elevated morally above external social dictates. That's a huge step.
And then the Romantic poets picked this up. Blake, Shelley.
Oh, definitely. They ran with it. They saw culture and convention as artificial, suffocating. They championed emotional experience, aesthetic intuition as paths to higher truth.
But disconnected from morality.
That's the key point Trueman makes. They deliberately detached these powerful inner experiences from any traditional moral framework. Beauty or intense feeling became its own justification, its own truth, regardless of older moral codes.
Okay, so the self is becoming more internal, more feeling-based. That sets us up for phase 2.
Phase 2. The demolition of fixed human nature. Mid to late 19th century. This is where some intellectual giants really started chipping away at the idea that humans have a fixed given nature at all. Well, Charles Darwin is huge here. His theory of evolution. It presented humans as evolving through impersonal natural forces.
Not created specially by God.
Exactly. If we're just products of natural selection, then the idea of a sacred purpose, a divinely given nature, that gets seriously challenged. We become biological organisms shaped by chance and adaptation.
Makes sense. Who else in this demolition phase?
Karl Marx comes at it from a different angle. He emphasized economics and politics, specifically class struggle.
How did that affect human nature?
For Marx, your nature wasn't some universal thing. It was determined by your class position, your role in the economic system. Morality wasn't about divine law. It was about serving the interests of your class. So again, no fixed universal human nature, just one shaped by socioeconomic conflict.
Undermining it from another direction. And then there's Nietzsche.
Nietzsche. Probably the most radical. He basically took an axe to all external sources of authority for truth or morality. God, reason, tradition, all gone, or at least fatally wounded.
God is dead.
That famous line. But Trueman points out the implication Nietzsche drew. If God is dead, we killed him. And now there's no external framework left.
So what do we do?
Nietzsche's terrifying answer was, you have to create your own values, your own truth. Become your own God, essentially. It's the ultimate burden of individualism, but it paves the way for the idea that reality is whatever we make it.
Wow. Okay, so human nature is psychologized, then demolished. What's phase 3?
Phase 3 brings us into the 20th century, the sexualization and politicization of identity. And the unavoidable figure here is Sigmund Freud.
Freud. Okay, his contribution.
Freud put sexuality, right at the foundation of the human psyche. He argued that our unconscious mind is driven by sexual impulses, libido.
And that repression is bad.
Yes. He saw the repression of these desires as a major source of psychological problems, unhappiness. He even framed it as a necessary cost of civilization. The implication. A healthy, happy life means fulfilling, not repressing, your sexual desires.
He really centered sexuality.
Absolutely. Even arguing that children have inherent sexual natures. Hugely influential, hugely controversial.
And then this gets combined with Marx by the Frankfurt School.
Right. Thinkers like Herbert Marcuse, Wilhelm Reich. They did this fascinating fusion. They took Freud's ideas about sexual repression and blended them with Marx's ideas about class struggle and power.
How does that work? Sex and politics.
They argued that the ruling class, the economic elites, didn't just control through money and force, but through psychological control. Specifically by controlling and repressing sexuality, especially through institutions like the traditional family.
So freeing yourself sexually is freeing yourself politically.
Exactly. Sexual liberation becomes a tool for political liberation. To transform society politically, you first had to transform it sexually and psychologically. Deconstruct the traditional family, challenge sexual norms. It all becomes part of the revolutionary project.
That's a powerful connection. And then the final piece of this phase, the sex-gender distinction.
Yes, coming largely from feminist philosophy, Simone de Beauvoir is key here. The idea that biological sex is one thing, but gender, how we understand masculinity and femininity, is a social construct.
One is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
That famous line sums it up. Gender is seen as something imposed on us by culture. This opens the door for the authentic self to reject those imposed roles, to define its own gender, potentially separate from biology.
Okay, so we've got Rousseau, the Romantics, Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, the Frankfurt School, de Beauvoir. Quite a lineup. How did these often quite dense academic ideas actually get out into the wild? How did they become part of just how people think?
That's where Trueman brings in Charles Taylor's concept of the social imaginary. It's a great way to think about it.
Social imaginary, what's that?
It's like the background understanding a society has about how the world works, what's right and wrong, what's possible. It's not usually based on reading philosophers.
More like the vibe, the cultural air.
Exactly. You pick it up from stories, movies, songs, conversations, how institutions work. It shapes your intuitions. Taylor uses the example of gay marriage acceptance. For many, it wasn't about reading legal arguments. It was about knowing gay people or seeing relatable characters on TV, like in Will and Grace.
So these ideas about the inner self, expression, sexuality, they just became part of that background hum.
They seeped in, became assumptions that shape how we instinctively react to things.
Now, Trueman argues this whole modern self project, even though it seems triumphant, is actually unstable. Why?
Yeah, this is a really interesting part of his analysis. He argues that when you try to build a society and an understanding of the self without reference to anything transcendent or sacred, God, objective truth, fixed nature, then reality itself becomes kind of up for grabs.
Meaning
It becomes a constant negotiation, often a power struggle between different groups trying to impose their definition of reality, their authentic selves. There's no final court of appeal beyond human will or feeling.
he gives an example, right? Pete Buttigieg.
Yeah, how even someone seen as representing progress within the LGBTQ plus movement could be criticized by more radical elements as being too conventional, too married, too normal. It shows how the goalposts are always shifting.
So even victories can feel like failures or compromises.
Leading to this potential for endless internal competition and redefinition, the quest for ultimate self-creation paradoxically leads to constant instability and conflict. That's the trap he identifies.
And we see consequences of this instability playing out, like prioritizing feelings.
Definitely. When internal feelings become the primary guide to reality and morality, then feeling uncomfortable can start to be interpreted as being unsafe or oppressed.
Like on college campuses sometimes, where certain viewpoints are labeled as harmful.
That's one arena where Trueman sees this dynamic playing out. It can make open debate really difficult if expressing a dissenting view is immediately framed as causing harm based on listeners' feelings.
And connecting back to the sexualized self, this makes it hard to critique things like pornography.
If sexual desire is core to authenticity and fulfillment is key, then yeah, objecting to something like pornography becomes complicated. Its normalization, he argues, further detaches sex from relationships, commitment, or procreation, making it purely about individual gratification.
And you could say something similar about how abortion is often discussed.
He suggests that justification often centers on the autonomy, well-being, and happiness of the individual, primarily the mother, framing it in terms of personal fulfillment and emotional health, rather than appealing to external moral principles or the status of the fetus.
What about the LGBTQ plus alliance? You mentioned the internal tensions. How does Trueman see that alliance functioning within this framework?
Well, it's politically powerful, obviously. But he points out that the different groups under that umbrella, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, actually have quite different, sometimes even conflicting underlying assumptions about identity.
How so?
For example, traditional gay or lesbian identity often relies on a stable sense of biological sex, a man attracted to other men. Transgender identity, however, often emphasizes the fluidity of gender and its separability from biological sex.
So what holds them together?
Trueman argues it's largely a shared sense of victimhood, a common cause forged in opposition to perceived societal norms or oppression. It's an alliance built on being against something, more than a shared positive vision of what identity is.
Technology seems to be a huge accelerant in all this, too.
Oh, massively. Think about medical technology, hormones, surgeries. They make the idea of physically altering the body to match an internal sense of self seem much more plausible.
It makes transgender identity more concrete.
Right. Trueman even says his book is fundamentally all about the decreasing importance of the body, the physical body, to selfhood. Technology enables that separation.
And then there's the internet, social media.
Huge. Online life allows for an unprecedented level of self-creation, self-curation. You can build an identity multiple identities even, that are detached from your physical reality or immediate community.
A panoply of identities, as he puts it.
Exactly. It's like a playground for the expressive, malleable, individual self. It turbocharges the whole process.
Okay, so that's the diagnosis. It's complex, deep-rooted, maybe unstable. What about navigating it? Does Trueman offer ways forward? He doesn't just want people to complain, right?
No, definitely not. He credits others, like Robbie George, with the insight that mere lamentation isn't helpful. The attitude should be more like, okay, this is the reality we're in. This is the hand we've been dealt. How do we play it?
Be constructive, not just critical.
Right. And he emphasizes engaging fairly with opposing views. No straw men. Lower the temperature, try to understand the actual arguments.
Which can be hard. He also says something potentially controversial for his Christian audience. The Bible is not enough. What's he getting at there?
He's absolutely affirming the Bible's authority for Christians. But his point is about persuasion in a culture that no longer shares biblical assumptions. Simply quoting scripture might not connect with younger generations or non-Christians whose basic intuitions about reality are shaped by this modern self.
So you need more than just Bible verses.
He argues for using subsidiary arguments. Arguments from reason, from nature, from observing what actually leads to human flourishing. Think natural law ethics, showing how certain ways of living align with our design, with reality itself, in ways people can potentially see even without sharing the faith. It's about building bridges of plausibility.
Making the traditional view seem reasonable again.
Exactly. And another huge piece for him is community.
The church as a community.
Yes. He says communities forge identities, for better or worse. He sees the success of movements like LGBTQ plus activism, partly in their ability to build strong communities that shape identity and provide belonging.
So the church needs to do that too, but differently.
It needs to be a place that actively forms people, shapes their moral intuitions, provides that strong sense of belonging and identity grounded in a biblical worldview, offering a compelling counter-narrative to the broader culture. An anti-culture, but in a positive sense.
It's important to add, though, Trueman isn't saying everything about the modern self is bad, is he?
No, not at all. He acknowledges real positives. Things like the development of human rights, greater freedom from oppressive old systems, a stronger sense of individual dignity, especially for those who are marginalized. It's a nuanced critique, not a blanket rejection.
Good. Because it's easy to just see the negative. Now, like any major work, his book has faced critiques too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some scholars feel he maybe doesn't emphasize the role of sin enough, that the ultimate root isn't just bad ideas, but human fallenness itself.
A theological critique.
Right. Others question his historical focus, suggesting maybe the roots lie less in culture and philosophy and more in shifts in law, like the rise of utilitarianism with Bentham. Or maybe overlooking scientific figures like Francis Bacon and the idea of human dominion over nature.
Different starting points for the story.
Exactly. And there's another interesting line of critique regarding his reliance on thinkers like Alasdair MacIntyre and Charles Taylor.
Why is that critiqued?
Because those thinkers draw somewhat on Marxist or Hegelian ideas, which can imply that society heavily determines individual thought and judgment. The critique is that this downplays individual freedom and responsibility.
So the alternative view is
that traditional Western ethics actually affirms the individual transcends society. That you, as a person, are capable of knowing truth through reason and conscience, and you're responsible for your choices, regardless of cultural pressure. Individuality here isn't just self-expression. It's about achieving a kind of moral wholeness. Your conscience always nudges you toward the good.
So you're not just a product of these historical forces Trueman describes. You can still choose.
That's the counter-argument, yeah. It emphasizes free will and the inherent capacity for moral reasoning, suggesting we aren't simply swept along by the cultural tide. It shows the debate is still very much alive.
It really is a complex picture. We've covered a lot of ground, centuries of thought, from Rousseau's inner feelings to Freud's focus on sex to the political and technological landscape today.
And seeing how Trueman connects them really helps make sense of why our culture feels the way it does, why certain ideas seem so powerful and intuitive now. He's given us a map of those invisible currents.
So the final thought for you, the listener, how much of your own sense of who you are, your authentic self, is shaped by this cultural water Trueman describes? Your intuitions, your feelings about what's right or wrong. How much comes from these historical trends?
And perhaps more importantly, what does it mean for you to think critically about that, to choose your path, pursue what you believe is true, even if it pushes against the current cultural flow?
It's definitely something to reflect on. This deep dive, hopefully, gives you some tools for that reflection, for engaging thoughtfully with yourself and the world.
And if you want to go deeper, Trueman himself recommends Charles Taylor's book, The Ethics of Authenticity. It's also published as The Malaise of Modernity, and also James K.A. Smith's How Not to Be Secular.
Good recommendations. And you can also check out the Public Discourse website. They have daily articles that dig into many of these kinds of issues. Lots to explore if you're interested.